Welcome to the 33rd reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. Tensions with my father. Although David and I managed to maintain our closeness, tensions at home permeated everything. Most of my instability stemmed from my father's volatile behavior, next to impossible to gauge his reaction to circumstances, because he could be perfectly easygoing, humorous and offbeat, and then suddenly switch to a rigid, angry, out-of-control person who looked as if murder was on his mind. Occasionally, as a family, we went to the Regal Cinema. Frustrating to have to wait for Dad to make up his mind over when he'd take us. Mum would drop hints that maybe we'd go, but even she didn't know if it would happen. Dad usually acted stern at tea time, and I'd try to read his mood, not daring to ask him outright if we were going. We rarely knew what was playing, so walked all the way there and read the billboard. Sometimes Dad declared the film unsuitable for children and threatened to walk us all the way home. Mum never said anything, but stood outside the cinema, resigned, as with everything else in her life, to whatever fate would bring. "Please, Dad, let's go in. I don't care what it is, I'll like it," I'd whine, desperate to escape from reality. The line of people would start moving, and I was sure that by the time we decided to grace the inside of the building with our presence, the film would be already halfway through. The films ran continuously, and quite often, in order to get seats together, we entered the cinema partway through one picture and caught the beginning when it rolled around again. This system enabled ticket holders permission to enter the cinema at any time and watch the program, a Pathé newsreel, a B film, then the main feature film, over and over again without paying for another ticket. Dad usually caved in to my persistence, and once inside, cozy and safe in the cigarette smoke-filled darkness, all my worries disappeared. Quite often, though, the film was entirely unsuitable for my eyes and ears, and I'd have nightmares for days afterwards. I particularly loved Danny Kaye musicals and thought him so clever, the way he sang the lyrics to a song so fast he barely breathed in between the words. I idolized him. Oh, what I would have given to have him for my dad. I wanted to melt into the screen and enter his world. I also liked Fred Astaire and Leslie Caron films. One evening we watched their film, Daddy Longlegs, and my father embarrassed my brother by dancing around lampposts and singing out loud all the way home. Even though his behavior bordered on unusual, it didn't bother me, as for once I could thoroughly identify with him. How good to carry the atmosphere of a film all the way home with you and fantasize for days afterwards. Happiness flooded through me because my father was happy, and the songs from the musical danced around in my head. Once inside the house, the front door closed behind us, he became a different person. When I started singing one of the songs he'd been gaily skipping around a lamppost to, he told me to be quiet. A deathly hush settled over all of us as we realized that our fun was over. None of us mentioned the film we'd so enjoyed together. Each of us retreated into our own private world. My father obviously liked music, but he refused to share his enjoyment of it with me. For instance, most school mornings I lay in bed, loath to leave the warmth of my blankets and face another difficult day at school. Perpetually late getting up, by the time I made it downstairs, David would quite often be already waiting for the bus at the top of the hill. I'd find myself having to catch the second bus, making me late for assembly. Then I'd have to stand in the hall, staring at the school clock without moving for half an hour as punishment. On an occasional school morning, the most beautiful classical music flowed from the wireless in the living room. Often the strains of Debussy reached my ears, sensuous, dreamy music. It helped me get up and face the day. I'd creep down the stairs, open the door leading into the living room, ready to enter the atmosphere of caressing music, when Dad immediately walked over to the wireless and switched it off. Sudden silence. Why he did this, I have no idea, and I couldn't ask him to put it back on. That communication denied because of the tension existing between us. His unwillingness to share the music we both loved intensified my loneliness and alienation. Did it do the same for my father? I think so, because in order to avoid being swallowed up by nothingness, we filled up the gap with hate. Why we chose that emotion over love is the saddest mystery of my entire life. My father worked hard to provide for his family. He came home from the factory and kept himself busy with jobs around the house, as well as tending the chickens and pushing his wheelbarrow back and forth to the allotment. He often disappeared into the shed to mend our shoes with new rubber soles and heels. He hammered steel blakies into the toes and heels of his own shoes, Dindin's and David's, causing them to make little clicking sounds along the pavement. Practical things were his forte. Few men nowadays can knit, but he could. His handwriting was stylish, and he made the task of wrapping and tying a paper parcel into a work of art. From him I learnt how to lay the coal-fire grate with little balls of newspaper, sticks laid criss-crossed on top, finished with ovoids, a fairly new inexpensive fuel made from coal dust. When huge, scary spiders appeared on the wall at bedtime, he expertly swatted them, although he would rather have seen them live. In all these things, and those more difficult, he reigned supreme. I kept 2 little pet mice, a white male named Wimpy and a black female named Minnie. Dad made me a wooden cage for them, complete with a nesting box, which they quickly made use of. After the first litter, he made a second cage to put the offspring in. The local pet shop bought the babies from me, which boosted my pocket money, until the mouse reproduction machine went berserk, and they refused to buy any more. They'd feed them to the snakes, but I loathed that idea. I didn't know what to do, so I asked Dad for advice. His only solution was to kill them. I wanted to take them to the park and set them free instead, but he said they would die a slow, painful death out in the wild, the fate he correctly predicted for the rabbits suffering from myxomatosis at Park Farm. Which was worse? One blow from him would be a quick death indeed, so that's what I chose for my mice. He went out to the shed and did it quickly, using a hammer, I think. I tried not to visualize it. Nothing to do afterwards but break up the cages and toss them out. I didn't have anything to do with the process. Didn't see the tiny dead bodies. Didn't want to. Afterwards, I despised myself for relying on him to do my dirty work. He may have dealt the death blows, but I held myself entirely to blame. Ashamed and embarrassed that he'd rescued me from something I let get out of control, I didn't even thank him. He didn't ask me to. The gap between us widened. His one luxury was to bet with Littlewood's football pools, listening to the teams that played across England and sending in his predictions on who would tie or win that week. Sometimes he asked David or me to randomly pick the scores. I didn't want to be responsible for the results, which I knew wouldn't be what he wanted. On Saturdays, he'd sit glued to the wireless, form in hand, listening for the numbers and checking off each one as they were read out. And nobody could breathe a word. He'd only won something once, and not a big amount. Mum quickly burst his bubble by telling him he'd not won anything, as he'd been sending them money for years. So we all knew what to expect after the announcer read out the results. A bad mood for the rest of the day, often persisting into Sunday, putting a dampener on the weekend. The following Saturday brought him back to hoping for the impossible again. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.